It was a dark and stormy night. Two friends, John and Mark, were home alone, their parents out for the evening. They were watching a scary movie in John's living room when the power suddenly went out, leaving them in pitch darkness. "Don't worry, it's probably just a storm," John said. "The power should come back on soon." A few minutes later, they heard a loud crash coming from upstairs. It sounded like breaking glass. "What was that?" Mark asked nervously. There was no response from upstairs. A couple minutes later, another loud bang, this time from the second-floor hallway. The sound seemed to be getting closer and closer. The boys froze in fear as they heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs, descending towards them. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and sonorous. The door to the living room slowly opened with a creak. In the darkness, they could make out the menacing shape of a figure standing in the doorway, staring right at them. The figure stepped into the moonlight streaming through the window. To their horror, they saw that it was wearing a striped jumpsuit, like an escaped convict. But its most frightening feature was the hideous mask it was wearing, a white mask with a skull-like face, vicious red eyes, and a sinister grin. The masked figure raised what looked like a large butcher knife, gripped in its gloved hand, and lunged straight towards them, letting out a bone-chilling scream. John and Mark screamed in terror at the terrifying masked figure lunging towards them with the butcher knife glinting in the moonlight. But just as the figure seemed inches away, the light suddenly flickered back on. The figure froze, shocked by the sudden brightness. John and Mark gasped when they saw that it was actually Mark's father standing before them, mask in one hand and carving knife in the other. He had been playing a joke on the boys. Mark's father started laughing. "Gotcha. Didn't mean to scare you boys so much." But John and Mark were speechless with shock, their hearts still racing. Mark's father frowned. "Come on, it was just a goof. I'm sorry I creeped you out." He turned and headed back upstairs. The boys were shaken up but starting to laugh with relief. "That was so scary," said John. "For a moment there I thought we were done for." They started joking and rehashing the frightening incident, calming themselves down. Just then, they heard another loud crash from upstairs, followed by a blood-curdling scream. John and Mark froze, realizing the horrible truth. It wasn't Mark's father they had seen before. If Mark's father was upstairs, then who, or what, had just been in the living room with them? The boys sat in horrified silence, too afraid to move, as they heard heavy deliberate footsteps descending the stairs towards them once again. The door to the living room creaked open, and the masked figure stepped back into the light. John and Mark sat paralyzed with fear as the terrifying masked intruder stepped back into the living room, butcher knife glinting in hand. The man wore raggedy prison stripes and emitted a foul odor. His features were mostly concealed by the macabre mask he wore, with its vicious red eyes and slitted grin staring relentlessly at the boys. The masked man uttered not a word as he slowly made his way towards his cowering victims. Despite their terror, John and Mark attempted to make a break for the door. But the intruder was too quick. In a flash he lunged forward, grabbing Mark and holding the butcher knife to his throat. "No! Please don't hurt him!" John cried out in desperation. The masked man cackled maniacally. "Beg all you want. You'll both die tonight," he snarled in a raspy voice. A savage smile spread across his demented features. Just then, Mark's father reappeared at the doorway, having discovered the intruder. "Get away from my son," he roared, rushing at the masked man. A fierce struggle ensued. The butcher knife was knocked from the intruder's grasp and went skidding across the floor. Seeing their chance, John and Mark dashed for the weapon. John picked it up and held it with a trembling hand, pointing it at the masked intruder. The man hesitated, then slowly backed away from Mark's father. Without another word, he fled the house into the stormy night. John and Mark, shaken but alive, hugged Mark's father, their savior, in relief and gratitude. They had survived a close brush with pure evil, and now the horrifying ordeal was finally over. The boys shuddered at the memory of the masked intruder's menacing grin and raspy voice. But they told themselves he was gone now, driven away into the stormy night, never to return. Little did they know, the night's horrors had only just begun. In the days that followed, strange things started happening in Mark's house. Whispers in the dark. Shadows darting past open doorways. Objects mysteriously moved or went missing. The family dog refused to enter certain rooms, whining and cowering in fear. Then, one night, the mask returned. Hanging ominously on Mark's bedroom doorknob. The boys told Mark's parents, who searched the entire house, but found no intruder. A week later, John and Mark were home alone again when they heard the footsteps on the stairs. Slow. Heavy. Deliberate. The now familiar creaking of the living room door swinging slowly open. The masked man stepped into view. He spoke for the first time. "You thought you'd seen the last of me." His voice was cold and lifeless. But his eyes glowed with murderous intent behind the mask. The boys backed away in terror. But there was no escape this time. The intruder raised the butcher knife and lunged. The masked man's true identity and motives remain a mystery. All that is known is that John and Mark were never seen nor heard from again after that dreadful night. The masked man's form towered over the terrified boys as he raised the dripping butcher knife high above his head. John and Mark screamed and cried for mercy, begging the intruder to spare their lives. But their pleas fell on deaf ears. With a chilling cackle, the man brought the knife swinging down towards the boys. They squeezed their eyes shut, bracing for the deadly blow. But the impact never came. When John and Mark opened their eyes again, they found themselves not in Mark's house, but somewhere else entirely. A dense mist swirled around them and the air was deathly still. They stood in what appeared to be an abandoned schoolyard, the rusted play structures creaking eerily in the wind. A figure emerged from the mist, a young girl with pale white skin and dressed all in black. She seemed to glow with an eerie light. John recognized her immediately. "You're the spirit I accidentally summoned during that Ouija board session last month," he exclaimed. The girl nodded solemnly. "My name is Emily," she said. "I have brought you here, to the land between the living and the dead, to offer you a choice." Emily explained that John and Mark now had a decision. They could either move on from this life into the next, or return to face the masked intruder once more, though this time they would not be alone. The boys looked at each other, steeling themselves. "We choose to return," they said in unison. "We will face that evil together." Emily smiled. "Then so it shall be." She waved her hand, and the mist swallowing them parted, revealing Mark's house, now filled with an army of spirits poised to join the boys in battle against the masked intruder. Emily turned to John and Mark. "Are you ready?" John and Mark steeled themselves as they faced the masked intruder once more, this time with an army of spirits at their side. The sinister figure turned to face them, red eyes blazing with malice from behind the skull mask. "You think those ghosts can frighten me?" the intruder rasped. "I am Malum, spirit of evil. None can stand against me." Undeterred, the ghostly army converged on Malum, holding him in place as Emily approached. "You have caused enough harm," she said. "Now it is time for you to be faced with the evil you have done." Malum struggled, but could not break free of the spirit's grasp. Emily placed her hand on his mask and chanted ancient words of binding. Malum howled in rage as the mask dissolved, revealing his true identity, the long-dead serial killer who had haunted these woods for centuries. With his disguise destroyed, Malum's power over the living vanished. The spirits forced him to his knees, holding him in place as Emily completed the binding spell. A dark cloud rose from Malum's body and dispersed, his evil spirit banished at last. John and Mark watched in awe as Malum's corpse crumbled to dust. The spirits slowly began to fade, their work now complete. Emily turned to the boys one last time. "You have banished a great evil this night," she said. "Never forget the power of light to triumph over darkness." With that, Emily vanished, leaving John and Mark alone once more. Though still shaken, they both knew, together, they had the power to stand against any evil that dared cross their path. John and Mark sat in silence for a long time after the army of spirits vanished and the house fell still once more. Though exhausted, they felt a sense of relief and accomplishment at having banished the evil spirit of Malum with the help of their new ghostly allies. Light was beginning to fill the room as the storm outside finally began to subside. As they made their way upstairs to check on Mark's father, who had been injured during the struggle with Malum, John turned to his friend. "You know," he said, "evil like Malum is always out there, lurking in the darkness. But as long as we have the courage to stand up to it, together, it can never truly defeat us." Mark nodded. "You're right. We may face more spirits and creepy intruders in the future, but we'll face them side by side." The boys found Mark's father resting comfortably, having survived his ordeal thanks to the healing powers of Emily and the other ghosts. He was delighted to learn of Malum's defeat, and proud of his brave son and his loyal friend. And so John and Mark returned to their normal lives, though forever changed by the events of that long and terrifying night. They knew that darkness would loom again someday, but they also knew they had the power within themselves, and each other, to stand against any evil, as long as they faced it together.